So I hear you all like action RPGs, so today we'll tickle that fancy by looking at Last Epoch, an early access action RPG that is nearing completion, that has enough layers and complexity to keep min-maxers happy, while still having enough granularity so that casual players can enjoy it as well without getting overwhelmed. On top of that, Last Epoch also brings a nice bit of time travel and a decent length, even in its unfinished state, and yes, it does have a post-game as well. Though before we go neck deep in the review, I should note that while I have played the post-game of this title, it is not what I generally play action RPGs for, since I much prefer the atmosphere and story of games combined with the theory crafting and itemization possibilities during the story progress. This is because post-game in the genre is generally just procedural generation to get bigger numbers through gear and buffs for players that want to continue to push their character further out of enjoyment of that character. And yes, the post-game in this is somewhere between Diablo 3's mind-numbing Rift system and Path of Exile's more convoluted but still just more maps to kill faster mentality. And more in the realm of Path of Exile's, the post-game does allow you to exploit more mechanics should you want to add more details to your build, but it is not something that will impact playing through the title itself, just the continued experience after the game. As far as the post-game goes, most boots on the ground aspects of it are going to be running post-game dungeons that, upon completion of segments of it, will give you permanent buffs called blessings. And while they talk about additional endgame systems potentially coming in the future, and there are a few other endgame systems, this is going to be the main process you find in most of these kinds of titles. For me though, what I find engaging is the puzzle of solving the storyline with what you find, and with the actually engaging systems it has available to you. Thankfully, in the case of Last Epoch, this exists in a few systems, though easily my favorite is the much more in-depth but much more digestible skill system, with its nearest rival being a game we will probably reference a lot, which is Path of Exile. But unlike Path of Exile, which requires finding an item with a specific socket connection and knowing how some skills work together while others don't, in Last Epoch, the skills themselves can be specialized in, allowing you to focus on abilities you know will work with that skill by advancing through that skill's unique tree itself. As you level up, you will gain access to more specialization slots, as well as minimum starting levels should you want to change your build entirely, and while you can easily use non-specialized skills due to the skill slot system, you will be using a full set of leveled skills by the end of the story, and probably be heavily specialized into a certain type of build. For example, in the playthrough we did for the Let's Play channel, we even had a ton of choices for how we approach the problems as a summoner exclusively, with each summon being able to be steered towards being either solo juggernauts with high stats, or swarm mode with lots of weaker versions. You're able to lean towards specific damage types, or even a variety of golems if you really want to. You can make your golem an ice one, your mages fire, and your warriors poison if you wanted a high variety, or you could focus them all on one and make an entire ice or fire party. And these specializations in the skills themselves could often be combined with paths on other skills to augment your units, such as one of your earliest attacks on the Acolyte actually having a path you can take to cause your minions to get buffs as you use it, and force them to focus fire on whatever your target you're focusing on with it. This in addition to having manual control of your minions with a dedicated attack button. Spells similarly are fairly adaptive. Do you prefer more range? A lot of spells have that option, along with piercing effects on some, damage conversion to a different element should you want to stick with a theme, conversion to damage over time instead of instant damage, a nice mix of straight buff options that keep it fairly stable, or sacrificial options that give up one feature of the skill to greatly boost another, such as massively increasing the cost to boost damage or lowering the cost to increase cast speed. Now, what skills you have the option of doing all depends on a few factors, since each of the 5 core classes have a core skill set that they always have access to as they level up through their personal trees that focus mostly on global boosts with a handful of perks here and there, but each of these 5 classes also has a choice of 3 masteries. These masteries are basically a selection that lets you specialize into a specific playstyle, locking you out of higher level abilities on the other masteries, though you can still get the low level skills and bonuses from them, meaning one necromancer could avoid lich or warlock skills entirely, while another necromancer might dip a bit into one to give it a bit more control of the battlefield at the cost of a little summoning power. This layered class and mastery system works quite well at keeping things relatively bite-sized, while still giving you a feel similar to the dual classing of games like Grim Dawn or the Greater trees like Path of Exile. All of this being sectioned off makes the game much more digestible while keeping these extremely large amounts of possible layers around. So instead of looking at a massive passive tree or a star chart you could read for hours, you're drip-fed chunks to enjoy in Last Epoch. Starting out, you have just your basic class tree. You get your first specialization slot fairly early, so you have a digestible class tree and just your pick of your favorite skill to refine, which means you have a handful of options to consider as you level up without having to ingest the entire game for planning your build. As that first skill starts to round itself out, you will unlock your second specialization slot, so you have one you've learned the options fairly well on, and now you have another reasonably new one to consume by itself. And the skill system and eventually the mastery system all rolls out this handful of information at a time method. And while you can look at them all beforehand, you don't have to, because it's designed around rolling out small bits at a time so that you can actually just chunk together the thing that you want to build in the long run with the pieces of information you have at the time. This is why Last Epoch is probably my favorite skill system currently in any action RPG, even beating out Path of Exile's materia style system with sockets and infinite combinations, which was my previous favorite, since the creativity is still there without the ungodly pile of reading or planning or luck. This is also helped by the fact that all of these skill systems have access to a search function to smooth things out, even in these more manageable spaces. So if you want to find all the nodes for fire damage, you can search for that and it will highlight your path even easier. Now, on the other side of the spectrum for action RPGs and what keeps me engaged with titles is the itemization system, and this is one area that, while I think Last Epoch does fine, it doesn't quite fit with what I would like to see most in a crafting system, even though it does hit a number of the high notes to keep itself interesting. This is because Last Epoch does a fairly RNG-reliant system, while also doing custom crafting systems. So while you have solid choices on the path you'd like your equipment to take for the most part, you do still have plenty of opportunities to be RNG screwed. This is because it feels like the game steers players towards what is essentially amounting to rares, or basically items with multiple modifiers on them, taken to reasonable levels, though to level up these modifiers requires a bit of random chance, since items work on an item potential system. This means that you use crafting materials to augment the abilities of items using a random amount of the item's potential, with the right setup giving you chances at using as low as 0 of the item's potential, to some effects using a massive chunk, sometimes upwards of half. As you get further in, there's more to mess with here, but the majority of the campaign playthrough, you'll be seeing limited use of this, making it a cool concept that really only comes to fruition in the post-game. Now, normally I'm not a huge fan of the system of breaking items apart for components for those upgrades, since it is often done without any real substance or planning in the components themselves, since it's usually broken into useless garbage like we see in games like Diablo 4. But in Last Epoch, it uses a system that gives the player much more agency over the crafting system. This is by, instead of breaking it into raw components, you instead shatter items and take their modifiers to be applied to other items. For example, if you find a weapon that has plus minion damage on it and break it down, you'll likely get a component that will add that plus minion damage to another weapon of your choice. Same thing for plus skill effects, resists, etc., with the only limitations being that only certain modifiers can go on certain pieces of gear, so you'll have to put offensive modifiers on weapons, defensive modifiers on armor, with things like rings and amulets getting their own flair. Now, I think there is a bit of missed potential for uniques and set items though, due to how they are not modified through normal crafting functions, with sets being completely impossible to upgrade currently, and uniques only getting improvement options in the post-game, and even then, it's more pinnacle goals rather than normal play, so chances you will see this if you're not interested in the post-game grind is pretty much nil, which causes it to fall into an odd space for me as a cool thing most players won't see situation. And while I'd love to go into a whole discussion on that and how a number of games are moving that direction by locking interesting and fun features behind post-game content rather than main game content, that's more in line with an opinion piece rather than a review. So just know it's there if you really want to see just how far you can push a character, but you're not going to use it if you're just interested in playing through the world a few times to try out the classes and moving on to the next action RPG for the next world. Beyond that bit though, we've got a fairly standard equipment slot system and even charm system that functions much like Diablo 2's charm system, but has a special inventory you unlock over the course of the campaign to hold more charms, rather than eating up your standard inventory space, which for Last Epoch is pretty much exclusively for carrying items to sell or salvage. So up to this point, we've basically got what is easily my favorite skill system in an action RPG to date, with a good enough crafting system that does a passable mix of things I like with slightly off-kilter RNG and some post-game exclusive systems. And some similar character modifying systems being post-game exclusive as well, with things like blessings. Which is fine, there is no perfect game, and this one is a really solid mechanical game with skill progression, even if it sits a little bit off optimal for me for gear progression. So pretty much all that's left after that is the story, which isn't quite done yet, but took me a solid 10 to 12 hours to make my way through 9 of the acts. While How Long to Beat places it closer to 15 to 20 hours, which tracks because I do play a lot of action RPGs and do tend to complete them a little faster than that site's times. As far as the story itself, I would say that it's not necessarily my favorite of the bunch, but it's good enough to keep you going and give you information about the world, time travel, and the MacGuffins you're going through, and even the zones you visit and why you're fighting. But generally, I felt far less invested in the world and story than I have been with games like Grim Dawn, Diablo 1 through 3, or even the Torchlight series. This is likely because it felt more like it was trying to shove us along more than get us involved in the world itself. Similarly, a few of the NPCs felt interesting, but not enough to keep me invested in them chapter to chapter, and it often felt like it was just pushing me along to find that next big thing to kill, like we said, which is fine, but I do feel how it engages you in all of this feels a bit weaker than its other contemporaries, even with the side quests and such that are possible for more lore. So for the most part, my interest in the world ended up coming more from the gameplay than from the story, with enemy designs being fairly interesting since you're spanning great swaths of time, meaning you could be fighting dinosaurs and giant insects one moment, and then fighting creatures made of ichor the next. And I doubt the final chapters they're working on will actually change all this, sadly, which is a shame, but for most players this will not make a huge difference, since it's still good enough for a single playthrough or even multiple playthroughs, and for the players that want to sink thousands of hours into it, it should be more than adequate to keep them interested with the gameplay alone. This does make me question, and this is looking far into the future, if there are ever plans for a Last Epoch 2 Electric Boogaloo. I don't think the world is engaging enough to guarantee its presence or attractiveness, even though the gameplay itself is very solid. So overall, I would say it's definitely worth the purchase if you're looking for a new action RPG to play with a solid skill system and you don't mind the slightly mid-tier itemization and story. I would really love to see more games that take cues from this fragmented skill and leveling system that introduces it in significant but not overwhelming chunks, and maybe we'll see a few more crop up with slightly more compelling narratives. And if you found your way to the end and want more reviews, guides, and other gaming goodness, be sure to drop a sub and a like since it really does help out the channel, and be sure to check out some of these classic action RPGs you might have missed.